Well, good afternoon and welcome. Thanks for making the time to join us today. I hope everyone is doing well under these rather strange circumstances. My name is Karen van Es and I work at Utrecht University, where I coordinate the Datafied Society platform. So originally this talk would have taken place in Utrecht today. And when we realized this would not be possible, we were very grateful to be able to organize the event online, and enabling us also to extend the invitation beyond our geographical bubble. Before we proceed, just a quick reminder that this talk is being recorded and will be made available for viewing afterwards. And so in order to also keep things running smoothly, we've kept audio off for all participants. We may choose to open this up towards the ending to ask for the Q&A. So we are very delighted to have with us today Professor Andreas Hepp. He will be giving a short talk on the pioneer communities and the making of deep mediatization. So for those not familiar, Hepp is full professor of media and communications and head of ZEMKI. I don't know if that's how you usually refer to it. It's the Center for Media and Communication and Information Research at the University of Bremen in Germany. In the past, he's been visiting researcher and professor at leading institutions such as the London School of Economics and Political Science, as well as the Goldsmith University of London in the UK. He is the author of no less than 12 monographs, including The Mediated Construction of Reality, together with Nick Coldry, Transcultural Communication and Cultures of Mediatization. His latest book, Deep Mediatization, examines how digital media is changing society. It was very recently published at Routledge and serves as the inspiration for this talk. In addition to Andreas Hepp, we are very happy to have with us today Professor Markus Stauff from the University of Amsterdam. He will act as initial respondent to the talk. Afterwards, the floor is open to you to ask questions as well. So I think we are looking at a program of about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, depending on the amount of questions we have. Regardless, I promised my partner I would get off the Wi-Fi connection by 5, so we surely will have ended by then. So without further ado, I hand over the stage, the virtual stage, to Andreas Hepp.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot. I hope you can all see now my presentation. It's working. Okay, good. Just to be sure about this. Well, thanks a lot for your invitation and that we can have this event now as an online event. It's my first event of this kind, so I'm also very much looking forward to and hope that we will have some discussion, some conversation at the end. As Karin already said with my talk, which takes about half an hour, I want to combine two things. On the one hand, I will give you some insight in my latest book about deep mediatization. On the other hand, I want to link this with research we are doing in various research projects. And this is research on investigating what we call pioneer communities. Everything, also this in that moment of time, has some relation back to the Corona crisis. And I want to take some examples across my presentation to, well, explain you how all this relates to deep mediatization and to pioneer communities. So think about, for example, the discussion we are all confronted with at this moment of time. How far a certain kind of app might support us to handle this Corona crisis. Or to take another example, there's a lot of information which we get about what's going on, which is based on what we call data journalism. So certain kind of presentation of data. So the point I want to make here is that how we experience this so-called Corona crisis is a deeply mediatized experience. We have all relation we have to this crisis, all the things we know about this crisis, all the things we know about Corona, all the ways how we imagine to address this crisis is something we have not only from the media, but something which we try to capture, try to solve by the help of digital media and infrastructures. So in that sense, the so-called Corona crisis is a deeply mediatized experience. This is the book Karen was talking about Deep Mediatization. And my reference back to this book is the chapter on the making of Deep Mediatization. So more or less the emergence of what we can call a deeply mediatized world. In all, I will present you a 5-step argument. First of all, I will start with some thoughts about the making of deep mediatization. Then I move forward to our research about pioneer communities, and will focus mainly on 2 kinds of pioneer communities. On the one hand, the quantified self, and on the other hand, the maker movement, and how they are created. And in the end, I will come back to my original argument that the way how we experience the Corona crisis has a lot to do what the engagement of pioneer communities like that had been over the last 10, 15 years. So let's start with the making of deep mediatization. So first of all, some very few sentences about what I understand when I use the term deep mediatization. Deep mediatization, from our perspective, is an advanced stage of mediatization in which all elements of our social world are deeply related to digital media and their infrastructure. So this is the basic understanding I start with. This has to do with various processes of change when it comes to our media environment, the differentiation of increasingly high number of different technical devices, the increasing connectivity, omnipresence, the path of innovation we are all confronted with, and datafication. I think these trends, none of them is new in this group of people who are together here at this moment of time. More complex it is when we think about what changes with deep mediatization. So how can we describe the changes which occur in society when it comes to deep mediatization? And the argument I tried to develop within that book is that we are confronted with something we might call a re-figuration of society. So the figurations, the social relations, we are all involved in change by deep mediatization. And we can see here at least 3 patterns of change. So first of all, we have completely new interrelations between the figurations we are living in. So think about the family as a figuration, the circle of friends as a figuration, our work experience or our workmates as a figuration, and so on and so on. Across all these figurations, a data infrastructure emerged with deep mediatization. And this fundamentally changed the relations of these figurations. A second kind of refiguration is what we can call an emergence of new figurations. Again, one example for this, think about platforms and the new kinds of figurations which group around platforms. Let's say Uber, for example. It was first of all a figuration of co-workers, drivers, which did not exist as a community. So it was somehow a figuration between any kind of community. But later on, these different kinds of people working for Uber built up across the internet social contact, and by that at least partly developed something we might call now a community. And the last, or third kind of refiguration is a transformation of existing figurations. So let's think about the figuration of the newsroom, looking back 25, 30 years before deep mediatization. It was really something which took place within the newsroom. Now the newsroom has spread across different locations, which make it possible for the people working as a journalist to address the Corona crisis we are in at this moment of time. So in all, what we can say when it comes to the Corona crisis is that the way how we experience it at this moment of time really has a lot to do with that our social world, our society was deeply mediatized before this crisis started. So what has this now to do with the making of deep mediatization? Typically, when it comes to the making of mediatization or deep mediatization, the crucial argument is that we should focus on corporate actors, the large tech companies, the state agencies, which push forward what we call deep mediatization. I think for sure it is right, we do not have or would not have what we call deep mediatization without tech companies or state agencies. But the point I want to make here is that we must much more focus also on what we might call collective actors. And here not only social movements, but also what we call pioneer communities. So other kinds of actors which have another role in the making of deep mediatization. And their role, the role of pioneer communities, is especially the role of opening up a space of imagination in which then tech companies and state agencies are able to act. This is something you can trace back historically for a long time. I just want to highlight here Fred Turner's work on the Whole Earth Network in Silicon Valley. So this group of people who emerged around the Whole Earth catalog later on produced online or print and then online magazines like Wired. This group of people who imagined a long time before a digital world became reality, how such a digital world might look like. The point I want to make here is that this is not just a historical thing. We can trace this network of people up to more recent, what we might call pioneer communities. And this is, for example, the so-called maker movement, the quantified self movement, or the hackers movement when it comes to journalism. So just a basic definition, who are the pioneers or what are pioneers in this context? All of the people involved in such kinds of communities have somehow a forerunner role in a particular field. Typically they are intermediaries, so they are not the cutting edge programmers, let's say it like this, or they are not the ones who have the large companies, they are intermediaries in between. They build communities like the maker movement or the quantified self movement, which have an organizational elite, so a particular kind of group of people who organize this. They develop experimental practices. And from my point of view, a very important point is that they mainly develop socio-technological imaginaries of possible futures. This just as a reference point about the research project, which is the background of the argumentation I will develop now. It's a larger research project in which we investigate two pioneer communities, and this is the maker and the quantified self movement, which brings me to the second part of my presentation, the creation of these pioneer communities. So in a nutshell, the argument I want to make is the following. Typically, these pioneer communities brand themselves as movements, as grassroots, as bottom-up, but they are something different. They are highly curated by an organizational elite, but curation means something different than control. And what I want to outline here is somehow how this curation takes place and how by this curation and imagination of a deeply mediatized world becomes communicated, not only in the US, not only in the Western world, but in various regions of the world. To start with some examples, we can have a look at a spread of the so-called quantified self movement, which has its origins in the Bay Area. So in the 2000s, you can trace it back to a meeting which was organized by Kevin Kelly, whom you might know from Wired, and Gary Wolf in a smaller place close to San Francisco, where they collected the first group of people around the term, around the idea of quantified self, and then developed a continuous meetup, which became the origin of the quantified self blog and the quantified self conferences, which took place only 1 year after the first conference was in the Bay Area in Amsterdam. Then we had a group of people who were really engaged in Groningen. Later on, we had groups in London or in Berlin. Somehow the same can be said for the maker movement. Sorry, this is just an overview of the different meetups of the Quantified Self movement in Europe to give you somehow a feeling of the trajectory of the emergence of these pioneer communities and what we now might call its decline over the last years. Same can be said for the maker movement. So again, it goes back to the Bay Area, where even the term maker was coined by Dale Dougherty, who then also became head of Maker Media, which in the meantime went bankrupt and is now Maker Community. They had the idea of curating these pioneer communities by large events, the so-called maker fairs. The largest maker affair takes place in Rome when it comes to Europe. In the German-speaking countries, Hanover became an important node because there is the Heise Verlag, a German publishing house, which holds the brand of Maker Fair for the German-speaking countries. Beside that, you have also an engagement in cities like London or Berlin. So this is a first insight in what's going on there. So while typically the maker movement, the quantified self movement, is framed as a grassroots thing, it isn't the case, or it's not so easy. You can trace it back to a particular group of people who, by the way, know each other very well in the Bay Area. The spread of the maker movement, you can see it quite well if you have a look on where the different maker fairs or smaller so-called mini maker fairs take place. So this map gives you an overview that is not just a European or North American thing, while Europe and North America became the most important regions where these events take place. As I said, these pioneer communities are curated, and curation means, in particular, from my point of view, 4 kinds of practices. First of all, the practice of defining, then selecting, arranging, and presenting. And all these 4 practices you can see as being done by a particular organizational elite for both of these pioneer communities. And more or less, this is what we try to investigate in parts of this project I was talking about, based on a media ethnography, doing qualitative interviews in Europe and the US, observations of events, and analysis of key texts and web pages. Well, I could tell a lot about this slide. I won't do this. Is just the data my arguments are based on. So how does this curation now takes place? The crucial point is that while both the quantified self movement and the maker movement can be traced back to Silicon Valley or the Bay Area, the models of curation they have are different ones, while there are a good number of linkages between both models. When it comes to the quantified self movement, one can argue that how this curation is done is by the use of what we might call an unenforced trademark. So this is somehow the trademark of quantified self, this QS, the term quantified self. Something which is in that sense an unenforced trademark that Gary Wolf started a process of securing quantified self as a trademark legally, but stopped this process. And by that, you're an in-between situation. So it's not really a brand legally, but no one else can get it as his or her brand. And this was used by Gary Wolf and other members of the organizational elite to come in a continuous process of conversation with all people who are somehow interested in the ideas of the quantified self. And this is self-measurement, this is using apps for individual data and stuff like that. I think you all know what I'm talking about at this point. How is this then used for curation? So the means or the instruments of curation the quantified self movements organization lead has are four. First of all, it is the publications, mainly online publications via the Quantified Self blog or the Quantified Self webpage. Then it's conferences. The conferences they organize in the US, but also in Europe. It is meetups. This means local groups. And then it is what is called prototyping institutions. So I took one example which links to the Netherlands, the so-called Quantified Self Institute, which was at the Applied University of Groningen, which is closed in the meantime. But this was one of the attempts of building up such kinds of prototyping institutions. Across these different instruments or means, we can notice exactly these practices of curation I was talking about. So when we look at a publication, it is about defining the core principles of this pioneer community. So defining what self-measurement in the sense of the quantified self means. Arranging an overall discourse about quantified self and presenting particular actors and particular particular actors, particular people, and particular projects as the ones who can speak for this pioneer community. The events, the conferences are again about the selection, arrangement, and presentation of particular speakers, products, and topics which represent best this pioneer community. The meetups work more on a smaller scale in the sense of these are really local meetings, in the meantime, typically with 20, 25, 30 people, where particular members are selected to present an individual project of self-measurement of using these technologies. And the prototyping institutions are also about selecting particular topics which are understood as essential for the present stage of this pioneer community and presenting them, by the way, also for academic research, academic teaching, and academic knowledge transfer. And you can see how this goes up to the present situation of Corona. How, for example, this is an example taken from the Quantified Self webpage, from the Quantified Self blog of this organizational elite in the Bay Area, Gary Wolf, the main figure behind Quantified Self, how he links this discourse of Corona with solutions, with a way of thinking which is typical for the quantified self movement. But the deeper point I want to make here is that the engagement of the quantified self movement now goes back more than 10 years. And we had a large media coverage about the ideas of the quantified self movement over this time. And I would argue that this coverage was fundamentally important for making people to accept particular kinds of technologies, particular ways of measurement, particular ways of collecting data, which we now exactly find again in the discourse about how national health services might use applications by Apple, Google, or other institutions to overcome the crisis. So it is somehow also a reframing of the discourse we know from that pioneer community. This brings me to the second example, the example of the maker movement, where we have a different kind of model of curation, a model which I would like to call franchising. So this is just an image to give you an understanding of what franchise means. So franchise mean at this point to have a certain kind of visual representation of all maker fairs, of Make magazine. So this is the printed magazine by the organizational lead of the maker movement, and also of related web pages and other kinds of content up to books. So it's a franchise idea using a particular kind of logo, using an established procedure of how to organize these events and so on and so forth. The point is a point which was also made by Dale Dougherty, who is the figure behind Maker Media, and now after bankruptcy of Maker Media, behind Make Community. The point he made is, well, of course, there had always been people who were doing tinkering. And of course, there was before that something we call do-it-yourself movement, whatever it is. But the point is, what he did, or the group of people around him did, was giving this a particular name, makers, by this a particular identity, and building a community of people by that. So it was the invention of a community for people who were before that just not linked at all. At least this is the argumentation he develops from his perspective. The means of curation, or the instruments of curation they have, are the different publications from Make, the Maker fairs, so these large events, and then the various spaces, the local spaces where people meet. And by the way, having a look here at these different logos, you already get maybe a feeling for what I have in mind when I'm talking about what curation means. Of course, if you look on the left hand, Maker Fair, this is obviously a branding. Yeah? On the other hand, if you look at the logo of the South London Makerspace, this is just a local space, which particularly has nothing to do in a direct way with the people in Silicon Valley. But they use their wording, they use their visual representation for explaining what they are doing. So the logo and the terms used by the South London Makerspace are not so far away from Make and Make Media, while they are at the same time not part of Make Media, of course. How does it look here with the practices of curation? So first of all, when we look at the publications, we have a definition what a maker is within that. Again, a selection and presenting of particular makers and maker projects as outstanding. But the point here is that all this is held together by a franchise model. So, for example, if you have a look at the German-speaking countries, the maker fairs here are done by Heise Verlag, which pays a smaller sum, first of all, to recent years to Make a Media, now to Make Community, to be able to organize these events, to use the brand. They have their own magazine, which is the German Make, and you have similar patterns in other countries. So while the printed magazine was not so successful in many countries, it is at least the Maker fairs, which is the huge thing, how this franchise works. And here, Dale Dougherty himself even uses, the term curate. So these fairs are for him about curating things, keeping the things in a complex process of curation together. Furthermore, we have these local places, as I already said, these spaces where the people meet, which are for sure independent from Make Community or Make a Media, but they use the discourse which was established by Make a Media for their own purposes and link back by this to Make Media. For example, in some of the spaces, you have models like that a magazine is there for free, or particular spaces can organize conferences, can organize local fairs and do things by this. So they remain somehow linked to the organization of Make Media or Make Community Now. And again, you can see here somehow a link to how being a maker is framed or reframed in the discourse around Corona. So the makers are the ones who are bottom up, who develop new models, who can be a help within the crisis, and so on and so on and so on. The discourse about being a maker, producing, do-yourself mask and things like that is taken up more or less one-to-one by the press. And we must be very careful about this discourse because, well, having a deep insight into the different spaces we are researching, I can tell you quite open, most of them are closed. The people also there cannot meet physically. And I really would question if complex medical instruments can be produced in a makerspace by 3D printing. So it's more about how a particular kind of discourse being pushed for many years by a pioneer community is taken up in public now. So what can we conclude from that? There are 3 points I want to make. First of all this curation is extremely fragile. So both of this pioneer community fight with their organizational stability. Everything is far beyond control. It is really very fragile when it comes to the organization. Financially, I already talked about the bankruptcy of Make Media, which is now Make Community. It is a highly unstable thing. These large events, for example, so if you want to do a big mega fair, you are in the millions of costs. It is high risk. It is hard to get institutions which support us financially and so on and so on. It's really a financial fragility you have at this point. And also when you think about a discourse, it is not a discourse which can be controlled by the organizational elite. You have various processes of translation when it comes to particular national contexts or local contexts. It's not a one-to-one thing. So we could think about or say, well, okay, how important is really the organizational elite and what is the power they really have? The argument I want to make is that this fragility is, as we would call it in software development, not a bug, but a feature. Because it is so fragile, these figurations remain flexible. Because it is so fragile, they can spread quite quickly across different countries. Because it is so fragile, they can link to existing local spaces and local groups. Because it is so fragile, they can continuously reinvent themselves. And because it is so fragile, they are able to link their discourses about how they imagine a deeply mediatized world ongoingly in a changing environment. And hopefully you got a point how much our imagination of the so-called Corona crisis also has something to do with imaginaries which were originally developed by the Quantified Self movement and the Maker movement. If not, well, maybe you might have a look at recent publication by various journalists and compare them with what was before that, years before that, published by the two pioneer communities. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your talk, Andreas Hepp. That was very interesting. I would like to ask Markus now to turn on his microphone and join in a conversation.
I will. Thanks, Karin, for letting me join. Thanks, Andreas, for the talk and actually also for the book you wrote, which is, of course, an even and much bigger effort. And I had the chance to read bigger parts of the book and was really super impressed by the breadth of the book. So it really aims for the people in here who didn't have a chance to have a look at it. It really aims at a synthesis of what is going on at the moment, what is the role of digital media and how can we best approach that. And I find that really impressive. I think the book offers some really valuable conceptual contributions. For me personally, it was mostly how Andreas approaches the concept of media as processes and focuses on what he calls the media as manifold, so really underlining that that we need to mostly study the interrelations between the constantly changing devices, their mobilization, their ubiquity, and so on. And he gives really a good tool set, I would say, to analyze that by, for example, just to pick out one thing, describing 3 different layers. He describes that there is a kind of a media environment that is the manifold, that is all the media that exist at the moment. There are ensembles, which means media which are connected through certain organizations. And then there are media repertoires, which are kind of the individual's capacity to use certain media in interrelation. And I think that's one of the really helpful things of the book, to give us tools to analyze these really complex and constantly changing interrelations. I think I have some more, let's say, conceptual projects about the conceptual questions about the book project. But I also don't want to take too much space and time here and let also the others ask questions. So I will focus on maybe 1 or 2 broader conceptual questions, which hopefully I think relate to what Andreas just presented about the pioneer communities. So of course, the key concepts are always the concepts which are most interesting to discuss, I think. So mediatization and how mediatization creates new or transformations of figurations. I think that is one of the key questions. And I think that the characteristics that Andreas also listed at the very start of the presentation here, what makes the deep mediatization specific, so the multiplicity of devices, connectivity, and so on, they're really convincing. But I nevertheless think it's interesting to ask, what does mediatization and deep mediatization consist of and what it is driven by? And of course, one of the questions is, how do we define media when we want to claim that there is a deeper form of mediatization? Because you could say that already since hundreds, if not thousands of years, everything we do as societies, individuals, is based on media, if we think about paper, writing, and so on. And I'm not saying that to make a kind of an intellectual point, but I think it is important for how we evaluate the ongoing mediatization and the changes it brings about. But as said, I want to focus on one thing that connects more specifically to the question of the pioneer communities, and that is on the role of actors, and actually human actors, in that process of deep mediatization. So what drives deep mediatization and what is the impact of that process? And maybe again, to frame it a little bit in, let's say, theoretical cliches maybe even. I wonder, Andreas, why you decided for the framework that you decided for. For me, I would describe it as a sociological framework, and a sociological framework that focuses on a kind of the social construction of reality. And maybe to highlight that, I think it's interesting, or I would be interested in asking, you reference actor network theory throughout your book, but you never take the step to also grant technology the role of an actor, I would say. You make distinction between human actors and collective actors, but these then are organizations, nation states, these are actors. And for me, that is an important point, because it provokes the question if what the human is and what the potentials of humans are to act, if they are themselves impacted by deep mediatization, and if maybe human activity or the potentials to act might not be the same any longer, and how we can kind of take account of that. So does the human role in mediatization have a media history itself? That is more or less what I would be interested in as a conceptual question. And maybe again, to not make it too long, I just mentioned 2 or 3 things related to the pioneer communities that I think would be interesting for asking that question. And for me, that would then be the question of what kind of actors are pioneer communities, and where do they get their role, their characteristic as actors from? So how do they gain the potential as actors or to act in relation to mediatization? And I found the concept of curation really interesting as you used it today, because curation for me, and I'm not an expert on that, normally is the capability to reorganize already existing things. So if you're a curator, you organize something, you have the power to present something because an institution asks you to curate something. So that is where you gain your power of agency from. And for me, it was not entirely clear what these 2 examples, the maker scene and the self-tracking community, what they actually curate. So that a maker fair curates things, that for me was clear. But what elements of mediatization do they curate? What do they take and what do they thereby transform? And again, pointing back to my kind of broader conceptual question, I wonder if we could, or if you could say a little bit more about the symbolic and or the material role of these pioneer communities in creating mediatization. So you make clear that they introduce certain key terms, certain ideas, certain promises of what we can do with media, but these are of course very selective, and they are very much dependent. That also, I think, was your example of being taken up, for example, by mass media. So the self-tracking community, the makers community, and there, especially your examples with respect to Corona, were really telling that to gain agency, they seem to need mass media or whatever to have an impact, to be able to curate some elements of mediatization. And if we take that, I wonder if it would not be also a possibility to use discourse, or I think you mentioned it in your book, the social technical imaginary itself as an actor, and see more the pioneer communities as some elements of that. They are kind of supporters, helpers of a certain social technical imaginary. So I hope it doesn't become too abstract. Maybe I can wrap it up as a question that kind of, why do you identify and focus on pioneer communities as makers of mediatization? And can you actually identify which elements they contribute to mediatization that are different from broader social discourses, from the social technical imaginary that circulates across different media? Maybe I leave it like that. I have a number of other questions, but maybe it's also more interesting to hear other people.
Karen, shall I say something directly as an answer, or do you want to collect?
I think there's a lot of food for thought there, but
okay, good. So I try to keep it short. I could talk long about that. Well, first of all, thanks, Markus, a lot for your words and your comments, which are really important and well thought points. I think I will start with your point about social constructivism or social construction and ANT, actor network theory, and the question about agency and technology as a possible actor or not. So first of all, what is important from my point of view is when we talk about construction, this is already in the book together with Nick Guthrie, it was not an accident that we call this the mediated construction and not the social construction of X. Yeah? So the idea really, and this is the argument we made there, and which is also for me an argument for the term deep mediatization, is that the way how society is constructed fundamentally changed with what we call digital media and the infrastructure. So with this last change of our media environment, which we relate to digitalization, digital media. And this is a deeper form of mediatization. So somehow mediatization has always been there. Yes, of course. We as humans have media, so instruments to mediate our communication technically for a very, very long time. But the point is that with this digital media and the infrastructures, the embeddedness of these media into our everyday life and into our practices became much deeper than it was before. I give you one example, which is, it's an example also from the book Deep Mediatization, which makes it maybe understandable what the difference is. So when we think about financial markets before they became digital, financial markets before they became digital, also media were used to represent what a market is. There were telephone calls and things like that. But in the end, it was a trading of people. So what we have now, and this already brings me to your point about ANT, what we have now is deeply mediatized financial markets. So the traders are sitting in front of 4 or 5 screens, what Karen Knossatina calls scopic media, where ongoingly information flows. Parts of the decisions in financial markets are made by algorithms. What to buy, what to sell. Parts are made by the traders, just on the basis of the feelings. And this really brings me to the crucial point, what I think, how we should try to theorize agency in times of deep mediatization. Where from my point of view, ANT falls short, actor network theory. And this is the point, no, I never think that technology has an agency in its own. That's really wrong. But I also think that the instrumentalist view of that it is about humans delegate just the agency to technology, that's also wrong. What we have is something different, and this is a kind of symbiosis between humans and technologies, which then developed that form of agency we have nowadays. So we cannot separate this from each other. It is really in the entanglement of practices with technology. So if you are a trader on a financial market today, you're sitting in front of these 5, 6 screens, and you are trading in interaction with these algorithms. But it's not just the algorithms doing it, and it's not just you, it is the entanglement. And so I really think what we have to overcome is this either or. Either the human or the technology, or the discussion about does technology has agency or not, yeah? Or is it only the human or not? This is not a point. For me, the point is it is the entanglement of both. And this brings me back to the history of all the systems we have now. If you look back at the 50s, 60s, how this world was imagined we are now living in, it was an imagination of symbiosis and entanglement of humans and technologies. These were even the metaphors they started with. But in a moment of time when they were technologically spoken, not able to realize these systems. But this was their orientation. So this is also an argument for me to take this point of view. Last point when it comes to pioneer communities, and agency and what their role is in the process of deep mediatization. So what I focused here in my talk was just one aspect of them, and this is the curation, the thing of the curation of the organizational elite. What in particular the role of these communities is on a more specific level are two things, I would say. On the one hand, it is their experimental practices. So they try out things in relation to technologies and human practices when they're not on the market, but no company does it. Yeah? So they try to figure out how to do it. So Quantified Self movement started with self-tracking when self-trackers were not just there for everybody. Yeah? They started with hacking particular kinds of technologies for using it for their purpose. They imagined certain kinds of new ways of how to do the self-measurement from in a quite early stage when companies were not able to do it. So what they do open by this is a space of thinking how it might be. And this is their particular role. And this space of thinking how it might be, there are two ways how this space gains an influence in processes of deep mediatization. One space is that these pioneer communities, these are also contexts where startups, for example, develops. Smaller companies develops. But these are also contexts where people of larger companies get ideas from, which they then take for maybe even to develop a product out of it. So this is one thing which is going on. The other thing is, so for the Quantified Self movement, you can take, for example, the Aura ring as one example, which was developed out of this community. And the other thing is that, yes, of course, journalism takes these communities as example for things, how they might change. And what we also did do was a discourse analysis about the discourses on these pioneer communities, where you can really show quite well that there are particular patterns how the self-representation of these pioneer communities is taken up by journalism and then presented in a particular way to a wider audience. Yeah, so you can see it again even in Corona times with the Maker movement. The Maker movement, these are the group of people who are able to find new solutions in times of crisis, while it's even something like the National Health Service is not able to address that. This is a discourse, and this is a discourse which journalists take from these groups of people without being able to prove. And so this is the other pattern, I would say, how the influence of these pioneer communities takes place. And the point I would make here is that we really must overcome linear ideas of influence or of making deep mediatization, in the sense that we say, okay, pioneer communities, they are the important thing, or it is the big 5 tech industries which are important, or it is this or that state agency which is important. No, it is how these different kind of supra-individual actors are engaged all together in producing this deeply mediatized world, which is a world based on an entanglement of our practices with various kinds of digital technologies. So this is how I would draw the larger picture at this point.
Great, thank you very much. Markus, does that, at least for a bit now, satisfy your questioning, or is there one small follow-up you would have here?
I think for the moment, I'm really content with the answer. I think there are some, of course, disagreements. I would still consider that technology has agency. I think that would be a really interesting discussion, which we could take up with respect to the examples you presented here. But I think before we do that, we first have a look if other people might have other questions, and maybe more specific to the pioneer communities.
Great, thank you very much also for raising questions. By the amount of people that have left so far, I think that's the Zoom equal of we should be rounding up right about now. I think for myself, I had questions indeed like Markus about the actor network theory. But before I close off, perhaps you can leave us with a bit of an elaboration on one of the final chapters in your book on the good life, living, right? On that more normative aspect of the argumentation. So perhaps you can just tell us a hint of that before we close this this online event off.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, the point is, in the end, so the book Deep Mediatization is more or less for me to try really to bring up or bring together what I was doing empirically over the last 4 or 5 years, partly on my own, but also partly together with other people. And in the end, writing this book, for me, the crucial question was, yeah, how should we, from a normative point of view, think about all these processes? And it is not an easy task. In my perspective, because very often you are in an ambivalent situation. On the one hand, these infrastructures, technology offer chances, offer new ways of doing things maybe better. On the other hand, you have the other side. It is also at the same time instrument of control of new forms of capitalism and so forth. So the core argument I try to develop in the end is that we should be aware that whatever it is, when it is about media and technologies, it is about how far do they support a good life for the largest possible number of people, or how far they don't support it. And here the argument I have is to understand what we call good life, not just from an individual point of view. You develop or you have a good life only in relation to other people. So it is about having productive relationships with other people, relationships which offer us to realize these projects, which we consider not only of importance for us, but also of importance for different kinds of communities, for example. And if you take this point of view, you end up by a criticism mainly how the organization of digital media takes place nowadays, because especially when it comes to media which are and infrastructures which are developed in the Silicon Valley context, they were developed having a very much individualized society in mind, which is about finding relations between individuals, supporting agency between individuals, and they are far less about public values, public goods, public institutions. And this is, from my point of view, the reason why we have so many problems we have nowadays, and why I try to argue in the end, we should think about finding new models of how to organize digital infrastructures and digital media. So this in the end is the normative view. I don't have an answer in the way of saying this or that is the ideal model. What I can say is that I'm involved also in practical projects of experimentally trying out new models. So for example, we have at the SAMPI one project in which we develop a new news platform called Molo News for moving local. So it's a platform for local news, which shall be developed, or which shall work not like Twitter does or Facebook does or other platforms do, which are focused on the one hand on the media corporations, on the other hand on the individuals, but which is mainly oriented to the different collectivities you have within a city and who are part of the public, and much more puts an emphasis on relating this. No idea if it will work out in the end, so we will go public in a few weeks, but at least I think these are the ways we should think about much more often than we do.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andreas, for your talk. And I hereby extend an eternal invitation to come visit us in real life once this is over. Markus, thank you for your thoughtful questions as well. And to everyone else, thank you for joining us today, for spending lots more time in front of your screen. I hope it's as sunny where you are as it is here in Amsterdam. Thank you and good day to all.
Thanks a lot.